Hi, my name is Albert Garcia, and this is my presentation for English 7222. My presentation is titled Contexts and Strategies for Intergenerational and Historical Literacy. So reflecting on the course, I was struck by, in several of the readings, the importance of literacy and communication in terms of history, in the context of individual and personal family history, but collective history as a society, as a group, and what does that mean? How does that impact the individual? And so I was struck by this question of considering how do we foster better literacy and engagement across generations? Because if you think about the interactions that take place in the classroom, at the college level, at the high school level, even earlier than that, you have several different generations interacting. So you have the students themselves, the instructors, the teachers, professors, and then the students' parents, and how parents or guardians and how they've impacted the students. And when a student comes to the classroom, they're bringing all of that and considering all of that taking place. And so I wanted to focus on several sources whose research and articles have looked at these questions in terms of, what are some things to consider regarding these dynamics, and then what are some strategies to help better foster that communication and literacy of history and individual family contexts. So looking at the questions of how do we understand the effects of generational trauma and orient our students and ourselves as instructors to be aware of how literacy has impacted parents and teachers and how it may impact them as students. Also, how to convey historic instances of oppression and marginalization and the effects on literacy and economic mobility that these occurrences have had on the same groups. Because these histories are important, recognizing them and navigating them are key to affecting positive change and building futures for students. So the first article that I found is called Family Expectations and Visions for Their Children's Future, the Role of Developing Cultural Literacy, from Dr. Ilse from Latvia. And this was interesting because it considers the impact and role of socialization on students in a number of environments, but the impact of family and how that affects students and how students bring that into the classroom. So students arrive in the classroom having been socialized in a number of environments, including other teachers and classrooms, but also by their own families, and that tends to be significant. So for better or worse, these environments here have a tremendous impact on what they bring with them. For instance, if we're looking at one of the other texts that we read earlier in the semester, The Outside Circle, we can see the negative impact that an individual's family history can have on them as affected by both generational and cultural trauma. So being aware of this is vital for instructors. It's also important to consider family expectations and hopes that often are placed on students. So this research study in Latvia remarked in how students often felt that they chose particular career paths or chose to study certain subjects based on the legacy, the impact, the input that their families have had on their education. So this seems to be, something that's cross-cultural, that is not just, something that happens in Latvia, but happens in the United States as well. So a family environment is crucial for not only learning about cultural norms, values, beliefs, and practices, but also for developing cultural awareness. So while understanding a family's past, present, and future can be an important part of that as well, understanding, where you come from as a student, but also where others are coming from. And so the family can often be a place of discussion about those topics. Oftentimes as well, older generations feel a sense of responsibility and accountability to the younger generation. Um, so at its best, family support can instill a hope as a key motivational source that may determine the process of shaping future goals and the ambitions for generational economic mobility. So this is considering that oftentimes, um, education, if it's set as a priority, even if parents themselves haven't had the benefit of education or literacy, um, parents from impoverished backgrounds even will instill in their kids a sense of education as a priority in the hopes that this will help um, their children as a student gain opportunities in the future. So the future for these youths is framed in relation to diverse factors. So the future as imagined by parents and grandparents as it relates to economic stability is believed to be achieved through obtaining good education, which includes cultural education. So this is seen as the means for assuring a good quality of life and well-being. So not just the ability for a student to do well for themselves, but to interact well with others. That if you're going to be operating in the world, in a classroom, in a professional setting, you're going to be encountering people from diverse backgrounds, and being able to understand that and relate to others is an important key aspect for that. And then finally, research has shown that involvement of the younger generation in things like volunteer work, interest groups, sports, dance, music, these sort of extracurricular activities can be an important part of a child's support system, but also is important for parents and guardians as well. They feel like their child, their student, is getting a diverse education, not just in the classroom, but through the socialization that happens with playing team sports, playing a musical instrument, doing artistic activities. That is sort of a holistic approach to the socialization and educational literacy process. The second article discusses sort of these skills that are important throughout the learning process, but even at an early age. There's been a lot of research that's been done in terms of looking at how important early childhood education is for future um, career and educational outcomes, all the way up to the college level. And so this research study done by Terry Sable and Teresa Eric Sommer and others is called Intergenerational Economic Mobility for Low-Income Parents and Their Children, a Dual Developmental Science Framework, from the Annual Review of Psychology. And it speaks to the issue of intergenerational economic mobility. This article offers a developmental framework to consider educational outcomes of parents and children together in order to foster said mobility. With a focus on two key populations. So this looked primarily at children in early childhood from birth to age 6, and parents in a particularly narrow age range from their 20s and early 30s. But the authors found that there were certain sets of developmental tasks and skills that were necessary or required throughout this time frame. So the development of academic and language skills, self-regulation and mental health, and the parent-child relationship. That the development of these skills and these resources can lead to improved educational outcomes. So when you look at this, the term of literacy, broadly speaking, you're looking at it from a number of different perspectives. So the academic side, the language side, but also the ability to self-regulate, the ability to relate to others, to interact with others, to be properly socialized. And that includes the parent-child dynamic. It starts with the parent-child dynamic. And so all of these factors work together in concert at an early age, and that these skills carry on um, from childhood into the later stages of education. But the study was important because it found that these skills were vitally important at this time frame. So we see that literacy, socialization, it starts with the parents, but it also involves the classroom. It's sort of this holistic approach to literacy and education. And so when we're looking at sort of the skills and things to consider um, in this environment of the classroom and how to foster intergenerational communication and literacy, I try to look at other resources that have provided some tangible examples. So what does this look like in practice? What are some things that have been done or tried to help foster this sort of communication across different generations? And so this study done at the University of New Mexico called Teaching Out Loud, Critical Literacy, Intergenerational Professional Development, and Educational Transformation was an interesting study because it involved um, 5 K through 12 educators who applied to be part of this professional development program through the University of New Mexico, funded as a fellowship program. And it involved these teachers sort of getting together and restructuring, relooking at how you talk about things like generational trauma, um, intercultural issues, and it involved sharing and dialoguing across different, teaching levels. And so the findings were really interesting because it pointed to this idea of teachers finding ways to better engage students. So the authors stated that educators who seek to center equity and justice in the classroom have found themselves increasingly marginalized over the past 2 decades for political reasons, but also within the educational sphere, with an emphasis more on testing, accountability, and scripted curriculum. And so this study wanted to look at this particular development program to see how educators engaged in a collaborative setting, drawing upon critical literary theory to reimagine the educational space, with the intention of the result being, an education, a curriculum that's more humanizing and student centered, rather than focused on policy goals or testing standards. So ultimately, 5 differently positioned teachers applied and joined this group. Particular attention was paid to creating within this group an intergenerational space, which was conceptualized as having experienced educators and pre-service teachers in conversation with each other in the hopes that this dialogue would enhance the willingness and ability to enact critical literacy in the classroom. So teaching out loud participants themselves articulated the ways in which their own identities were denied in school and in classroom spaces. And so by the participants recognizing the ways in which um, being willing to be vulnerable with students and to discuss their own family history and personal histories, that this became a mode of deconstruction, a form of resistance to a system that privileges certainty and discourages sort of weakness in educators and in the classroom. So these participants, using their knowledge of policy failures, which they've experienced, teachers directly confronted the limitations of curriculum and mandated professional development in order to create opportunities for students to be visible in classroom spaces. So with they found that the teachers, educators being vulnerable, talking about their own experiences, helped open up the students so that they could share their own experiences, and it created this dialogue. So you have the goal of this cross generational dialogue opening up, so students are more aware of their professors and their experiences, and vice versa, so that they found that this approach helped facilitate that. And they found specifically that the importance of educators naming oppressive circumstances, deconstructing power relations, and reconfiguring their practice, that this occurred on two levels. The teachers were creating and implementing innovative projects while also analyzing their practices as part of this shared professional development group, which took place in an area in New Mexico that was not particularly wealthy or affluent. Often, many of the schools in this area in Albuquerque, New Mexico, were struggling for funding. And so by the University of New Mexico and the city, through this grant, through this fellowship, they found that allocating these resources with the intention of having a program like this ultimately could be successful and could be a model for others to follow. So further, the authors of this article, which looked at this teaching out loud project, they theorized that critical literacies facilitate the recognition of how dominant discourses reproduce the status quo and reinforce longstanding disparities on social class, race, gender, sexuality, and other markers. Oppression and inequality are produced collectively and individually, both by actions and by failures to act. So centering critical approaches to education can help us name and interrogate practices in order to change them. Specifically, critical literacies focus on language as social practice and examine the role played by text and discourse in either maintaining or transforming society. So reimagining curriculum in ways that more accurately reflect and critique our global capitalist context is central to the work of social justice educators who seek to put critical literacy at the center of their practice. While questioning and deconstructing dominant narratives are essential critical literary practices, educators and students must move beyond interrogation to embracing terms of a critical imagination for redesign to contribute to the process of creating a world that is both just and sustainable. So we see here that the goal, the theory behind this approach is that reflecting and critiquing the systems in power as done through a voicing of and giving name to actions that have been done to individuals and groups, that process can help deconstruct and challenge sort of the dominant paradigms that control things like education, policy, politics. And so the theory seems to be one that can have some practical benefits as well, as evidenced by the outcomes of this research effort. And then finally, if we look at another project that attempted to facilitate this sort of intergenerational dialogue, communication, and literacy, there was another interesting research effort that I found called Bridging the Digital Divide for Older Adults via Intergenerational Mentor Up. So this Mentor Up program was one that it was an innovative intervention that engaged college students tutoring older adults. So whereas you often see with young people, with younger students, you have older students sort of mentoring and tutoring. The idea was to innovate that, to sort of turn that around and see and have older adults learn from students, learn from younger people. So IMU, the Intergenerational Mentor Up program, was focused on the issue of e-literacy and how it could help ease the burdens of social isolation that often occur with older or elderly people. So a total of 55 older adults with the mean age of around 73 participated in 6 sessions of this IMU tutorial program. So they found that the older adults presented significant improvement through these 6 sessions with college students, where 55 older adults were paired with a college student. And they found that these sessions helped improve things like e-literacy, e-health literacy, um, help reducing technophobia, help increase self-efficacy, and facilitate an interest in technology. So intergenerational interaction here brought about by this program helped to decrease social isolation among older adults. The study's findings enable the identification of the training needs to help close the digital divide and allow older adults to reap the benefits of technology use. So we see here another sort of innovative effort, research effort to help find ways to bridge the divide amongst generations. Here in the context of technology, they found that some of these older adults were not used to using things like cell phones or computers or laptops or web applications. And given the importance of technology, especially in today's world, this is seen as sort of a vital skill. And so with college students, seeking to mentor older adults, not only were there benefits in terms of the practical skills in learning how to use some of these technologies, but also the socialization, the social benefits and psychological benefits of interacting with a young person in a social and productive manner. And so I thought this was another, really great practical example of ways that we can sort of incorporate and acknowledge the assets that each generation has, that we all have something to learn. Nobody knows everything, and so I thought this is really a great tool that was researched by this group here. So in conclusion, through these articles, through these research efforts, we see that literacy and communication across generations takes place on a number of levels. How families socialize students, how they interact and communicate with things like technology, and how this is important for learning across cultures and within individual family histories. And we see that families will often place an importance on education and expectations for literacy, for educational and economic advancement, in the hopes that a better future is achieved, by the younger people, by the younger generation. So giving space for discussions through things like professional development programs, intergenerational programs, can help students better understand themselves and each other in a classroom setting and in their future careers. So we see really the crucial importance of being literate in terms of not just your own culture, your own family history, um, and being aware of what your family has gone through, what your parents, grandparents, what your guardians, what they have done, um, for better or for worse, um, tracking that history, which can be painful at times, as we saw in the outside circle earlier this semester. This is not, for many people, this is not an easy thing. This is not, this can be a painful experience, but understanding that can help sort of, can help students orient themselves in the future towards obtaining their own goals. But not just that appreciation of individual, personal, and family history, but the history of groups, the history of marginalized groups, and how that's affected things like literacy and social mobility, and how those two are intimately tied together. And so overall, I think, reflecting on the readings, the articles, the research efforts here, I was really fascinated with things like um, the Teach Out Loud program, where you have, professors teachers, educators, experimenting with ways to better reach their students, to better understand their students, but also for students to understand them better. Likewise, with the technology and mentoring of older adults by college students, I thought was a really interesting and unique program. And so I think thinking creatively, thinking outside the box, trying to find ways to acknowledge the skills and traits and benefits of other people, other cultures, their generations, and accounting for that and giving space to having those conversations seems to be really important and can be beneficial, as evidenced by the outcomes of these research efforts. And so overall, I think as an educator myself, having just finished the semester teaching undergrads, I see even now with these freshmen and sophomores and myself, there's still, it seems like a generational divide, and it does require some work to facilitate and ease that communication amongst students and teachers. And I think that thinking creatively and trying to find ways to make sure that students feel heard, giving them space to share their own experiences, and being vulnerable and talking about my own experiences, that's definitely a strategy that I think I'm going to incorporate in my future classroom settings. And so overall, I thought this was a really interesting research work that's being done, and I think is fruitful ground for other research projects in the future. So thank you. That's my presentation, and thank you for everything.